Welcome back to Unfuck the Poor, the economic podcast that uses a shitload of profanity and suggests that the wealthiest humans and corporations on the planet should go penetrate themselves with their own economic fucksticks. Of course, we do discuss serious things at times, like that chapter about the 2008 economic crash and the real-world effects of the atomic bombs on humans. This is Chapter 8, Murder for Bananas, and this is just a reminder that you can find the full PDF of Unfuck the Poor at askaleftist.com, along with show notes and links to sources and supplemental media. Anyway, I hope you really, really like bananas. Like, really like them because, well, you'll get the idea.
It is interesting that while we think of the banana as a hearty food, this is only because so much care is taken to see that it arrives on our tables in good condition. For the banana must be cut green and ripened artificially. It is one of the few fruits that loses its flavor if allowed to ripen on the plant.
Unfuck the Poor, Chapter 8, Murder for Bananas. When global war is not an option, local terror campaigns against democratically elected governments will do just fine. America loves a good old-fashioned coup d'etat. And a coup d'etat, if you didn't know, means replacing one political leader with another. In the American tradition, it is making sure the new leader will do what you say. I cannot, in any comprehensive way, explain every coup that the U.S. has actively backed. There are too many. William Bloom's Killing Hope, U.S. military and CIA intervention since World War II, would be the most comprehensive book on the topic. It has 56 chapters and 3 appendices, one on money flows, one on military force prior to World War II, and a list of assassination plots. Even Bloom's book is not 100% comprehensive because the ones written about are the ones that we actually know about. The U.S. is believed to be involved in many more, but there is insufficient evidence to substantiate. The involvement of the U.S. in international affairs has never been about protecting the lives or interests of actual humans. You can look to the mass civilian casualties in Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and, well, fuck it. Anytime the U.S. suggests a foreign country is a bad guy, you can assume we're killing civilians there or are about to. Equally, you can take a look at certain conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Russian annexation of Crimea, as U.S. indifference to the value of human life. Many Crimeans were abducted, tortured, or simply disappeared by Russian forces. And in Palestine, enough has been reported in the international press for Americans to understand, in basic English, were the Council on Foreign Relations interested enough to spread true understanding, that Israel actively engages in crimes against humanity as a matter of policy. Civilian deaths by Israel are high, children regularly among them, and the practice of shelling Palestinian territory is known by many as, quote, mowing the lawn, or indiscriminately cutting down everything in its path. Mowing the lawn, as it were, is occasionally a spectator event. A Twitter post by Alan Sorensen from July 9, 2014, shows Israelis gathered on a hilltop in Sderot overlooking Gaza. They are seated in lawn chairs, and Sorensen's post claims that the Israeli spectators clap when blasts are heard. Anyway, do you want to know why Elon Musk is an asshole? On July 25, 2020, Twitter user @HistoryOfArmani tweeted at Elon Musk, "You know what wasn't in the best interest of people? The U.S. government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you could obtain the lithium there." And Elon Musk's reply was, quote, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." End quote. The American coup is alive and well, if a little less effective than previous decades. Musk's coup attempt was a failure, though not without consequences. Evo Morales, who had won election to become Bolivia's president in 2005, a democratic election, mind you, ran on policies that put Bolivian people first. He implemented a tax on the petroleum industry to fund social programs to eliminate illiteracy, poverty, racism, and sexism, and push for economic independence from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, meaning he was directly fucking with a world order that had been set in place 60 years prior. Morales had the nerve to be from Bolivia's Aymara indigenous community, representing nearly half of the country. His party, the Movement Toward Socialism, dared to push the notion that nationalizing its lithium production, which Musk's Tesla requires for its batteries, would be in Bolivia's best interest because, well, I mean, otherwise, basically, Tesla just had control over a nation's resources, which, broadly speaking, is fuck you, Elon Musk levels of fucked up. But there is something telling in the candidness of Musk's trolling. A corporation such as Tesla cannot, in theory, openly depose a democratically elected president and install a new one. That would be too out in the open. But a corporation, and more importantly, the face of that corporation, who is, let's face it, a fucking asshole, can seek assistance from the nanny state to get what it wants. The nanny state originally was meant to describe a government with too much control or one that is overbearing, but a nanny isn't necessarily that. A nanny can coddle and spoil and treat a child like it's the most precious thing on earth, inflating its ego and turning a blind eye when it does naughty things like coups. It also provides a shitload of money. The problem with American perception of governments and political parties such as Bolivia and Morales' movement toward socialism is that they are so far removed from American life that we are at the mercy of easily manipulated information in the States. We are so strapped for attention that the phrase, quote, watchdog group is at once meaningless and implicitly trustworthy. A watchdog is loyal and protective, and we give them little more thought than that. So, when a watchdog group, such as the Organization of American States, runs an analysis on a foreign election and issues a press release alleging election fraud, it is viewed as merely a neutral party doing due diligence and, oh, hey, look, he's a goddamn commie socialist. And when challenged, the OAS might release an additional press release that goes on and on about why the New York Times is a shitty newspaper. I could agree with that assessment on some merit, see Christopher Caldwell's ignorant take on redlining, but the OAS had to eventually concede that their own coding used to analyze the Bolivian election results had a goddamn bug in it that made its entire analysis of the election wrong. And so, on the merits of watchdog group claims of fraudulent elections, you can wind up with the resignation of a democratically elected president like Morales, which was protested by Bolivians because, they fucking voted for him, and the stepping in of an interim president who is the polar opposite of the president she is replacing, like Janine Áñez, a far-right anti-socialist to the point of justifying the killing of no fewer than 23 pro-Morales demonstrators. With the basic understanding of what a coup is and how it works, we can talk about bananas. Remember when I said the Dulles brothers were assholes and that I'd get back to them later? Well, I'm getting back to them because it's later. And I hope you like bananas, really like them, really, really like them, because this is what the United States is willing to do to get you your precious fucking bananas. But let's first define Banana Republic. That is a country reliant on one primary limited resource export for the bulk of its economy. It is highly susceptible to coups. The Western definition requires a country to have an unstable government, though we will explore why their governments are unstable. Now, the Dulles brothers worked together at the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, owning many of their clients' corporate stocks, and this is equally important as their future work within the government and the CFR. John Foster Dulles headed a CFR group in 1934 that concerned economic self-sufficiency for the United States, and Allen Dulles worked on the Anglo-American Relations and Trade Study Group from 1936 to 1937, and was Secretary of the Council on Foreign Relations from 1939 to 1943. That was when the CFR was figuring out how to put the U.S. at the top of the global economic order, where he worked on such projects as studies of American interest in the war and the peace, and so on. John Foster also worked on the war-peace studies, which were discussed and I will say informally ratified and then sent along to the U.S. State Department. Anyway, Allen Dulles was keenly aware of Europe's role in Latin American trade. That is, many of the economies in Central America relied on regular exports to Europe and specifically to Nazi Germany. But in 1939, shipping between Latin America and Europe, and specifically to Nazi Germany, left their economies with huge surpluses of things like coffee and bananas. I say keenly aware because the Dulles brothers' employer, Sullivan and Cromwell, had negotiated with Guatemalan regimes on behalf of their client, United Fruit Company, for enormous tracts of land in the country. United Fruit also owned International Railways of Central America, having purchased it in 1912, and that gave United Fruit a rail and port monopoly. Electric Bond and Share, a General Electric company, had been handed Guatemala's power grid after the U.S. seized control of it from Germany after World War I, and Electric Bond controlled about 80% of Guatemalan power. Land resources were lopsided, with 2% of landowners in possession of 72% of the total available land. Jorge Ubico, the president-elect in the 1931 presidential race of exactly one candidate, was quite favorable to United Fruit. Ubico's government didn't fuck with United Fruit. It gave them preferred tax rates and exempted them from labor laws. Ubico was, as dictators and talking heads are, a fuckwit of a leader, and World War II caused a social awareness of sorts. Guatemalans realized, hey, this douchebag who keeps inviting foreign companies in to monopolize our infrastructure and back oppressive measures that keep us ass-fucking backwards isn't working in our best interests. And in 1944, that social awareness, in the minds of students, activists, middle classes, urban workers, and key military leaders, were like, all right, fuck off, Ubico. We want this guy to run the country. So they held a democratic election, and some guy, some fucking professor of philosophy named Juan Jose Arevalo, who had been exiled from Guatemala, won 86% of the vote in 1945. Holy shit. Well, the Dulles boys didn't like that. Juan Jose Arevalo helped install a new constitution guaranteeing such horrible things as an 8-hour workday, minimum wage, the regulation of child and female labor, severance pay, paid vacations, a social security system, the right to unionize and strike, labor tribunals for strike settlements, the freedom of political parties, secret ballots meaning you could vote anonymously, an apolitical military force, mandatory voting with secret ballots for literate males, optional public voting for illiterate males, and optional secret voting for literate but not illiterate females. That fucker. I bet he also built new schools and hospitals and worked to integrate the indigenous Indian population while preserving their culture. God damn it, he sure did. Fuck. Well, he did not do anything about all that hoarded land held by corporations, and he didn't do anything about the tax preference system either. But the Arevalo presidency did set the stage for Jacobo Arbenz, who was elected in December 1950. And Arbenz was going to do something about all that land. And the funny thing is, Arbenz's goal was to transform Guatemala into a modern capitalist state, meaning that Guatemala would be its own country, not under control of the massive corporations that held most of its land. Now, to put this into perspective, a corporation that runs all of your railways and ports and utilizes nearly all of your land and sells you your own power is basically the actual governing body. Some call United Fruit a nation within a nation, but that is backwards. Guatemala had become a nation within the United Fruit Empire, and Arbenz wanted his goddamn country back. Well, I mean, it wasn't his, he wanted it for all Guatemalans, and here's the fucked up thing about all that land, or 80% of that land, it wasn't being used. So Arbenz restructured the land. Now, some land had been seized from German coffee growers during World War II, and Arbenz broke it up into small 8 to 12 acre plots and set rental rates to favor farmers. This is something that he actually did. An estimated 100,000 farmers or farm cooperatives received their tracts of tillable land, about 1.5 million acres. There was also expropriated unused lands, which the Guatemalan government took from land hoarders, or expropriated, and set up payment plans to the previous owners for the trouble of reclaiming land that had been arguably gifted by a more favorable dictator sometime in the past. There was some other bad fuckery going on down Guatemala way. Arbenz was setting up a hydroelectric plant to gain energy independence from the GE subsidiary and was constructing highway systems to get out from under United Fruit. He was making batshit crazy policy decisions like increasing taxes on imported luxury items and even tried to establish income and capital gains taxes. Listen, this guy was trying to build America, and the American Dulles boys were like, fuck that, we do international business because we don't like all that bullshit. We'll coup who we want. Of course, the consequence of all these policies was that Guatemalans and indigenous peoples would no longer have to live in squalor, nor would they have to live under the thumb of United Fruit. That was the real practical outcome that Arbenz wanted for his country, and the real practical effects were that the corporate interests were no longer being catered to. In fact, the new democratic Guatemala had become a check on the international aristocracy that had been able to benefit from imposing a sort of uniform code, the law of capital markets, private ownership of land, resources, utilities, and the right to use labor at its discretion. The phrase economic freedom looks much like Guatemala in the Yubico era, private enterprise operating free from government interference. Workers and farmers were unionized. They were emboldened by the right to strike, and they did. They protested the conditions of the U.S. corporations. They were no longer controlled by the outside interests of an upper class. The situation in Guatemala was transforming into something the founding fathers of the United States feared. The majority had managed to fight against the opulent minority and was gaining ground. There was too much goddamn democracy. And because this was not the United States could bomb the fuck out of them and wage terror campaigns. You can't do that on domestic soil, unless it's against black, indigenous, and people of color who are standing up for their rights to be treated as humans and not be brutalized and murdered by police, in which case the U.S. will absolutely send out the National Guard to prevent the spread of too much democracy. By 1954, President Eisenhower and the Dulles boys decided it was time to fuck up the Guatemalan peasantry for daring to not be fucked up by U.S. corporate interests. The U.S. go-to? Communism. Remember that Texas mayor who blamed socialism when Texans needed help during a freak blizzard and then essentially told all those Texans to fuck themselves? That was communism in the 1950s. Of course, you couldn't go out and make flyers against Guatemala saying, look at all this stuff they want that we have, but they shouldn't have it because, god damn it, our bananas are down there, because that would seem like the United States was against things like the minimum wage, 8-hour workdays, and Social Security. Many of the policies of the democratically elected government were near copies of Roosevelt's New Deal. So Eisenhower lied. He claimed Arbenz' government had been infiltrated by the Soviets and that communist terrorism in Guatemala was the reason that coffee prices had gone up, not the newfound autonomy of the democratically elected Guatemalan government. Obviously, the Soviet Union needed to explain itself, and the Soviet Union said, well, you see, what the fuck is a Guatemala? Because they literally had no interest in the country. Aha, said the increasingly paranoid McCarthy brand of far-right anti-communist American politics. By their denial, they are of course guilty of communism. Someone fetch a stake so we can burn the witches. But the U.S. had nothing whatsoever to link Guatemala and the Soviet Union, because it wasn't there. And they turned the whole thing into a propaganda campaign using public relations terminology. From William Bloom's Killing Hope, the U.S. employed the following word tactics. Thus, communists, unlike normal human beings, did not take jobs in the government, they infiltrated the government. Communists did not support a particular program, they exploited it. Communists did not back Arbenz, they used him. Moreover, communists controlled the labor movement and land reform. But what type of person is it who devotes himself in an underdeveloped country to furthering the welfare of workers and peasants? End quote. And I'll tell you, it's communists. That's who. For this next section, I want you to periodically take a break and say the words bananas and coffee aloud. Tell you what, I'll even help you out in that department. So let's continue. To overthrow the Arbenz government, the CIA, directed by Allen Dulles, and if you haven't figured it out yet, yes, the Washington Dulles International Airport guy, set up operations in Opalaca, Florida, roughly a 3-hour flight from Guatemala, and set up a training camp in Nicaragua. But who would be selected to train the ragtag group of rebels? It couldn't be the United States. It would have to be an organization with immense resources but no political affiliation, something like a banana monopoly. So United Fruit hired a former U.S. Army colonel, Carl Studer, to whip the troops into shape. The CIA set up a weapons depot in the Panama Canal Zone, and because Bananaco owned the railroads, they smuggled the weapons into Guatemala via their own trains. The CIA staged their, quote, rebels in Honduras. You could just hop in a jeep and drive over the border. The CIA allocated 30 planes and pilots provided Soviet-marked weapons to be planted inside Guatemala so they could say, told you so. They sent out 2 submarines and 3 bombers to Nicaragua. Economic warfare was also strategized, such as cutting off Guatemala's credit and disrupting oil supplies. And the war of words continued, with the CIA producing hundreds of articles to be published about the communist takeover within Guatemala. As we have seen in the case of Acorn, creativity in the news media is not a prerequisite for publication. So the news stories got picked up, went unverified, and they were republished and circulated. It became a matter of fact that Guatemala had been infiltrated by communists. Bananas, coffee. On June 18, 1954, the CIA began fucking shit up. In the morning, planes dropped flyers over Guatemala demanding Arbenz's resignation, and in the afternoon, the planes returned and dropped fragmentation bombs and opened fire on the National Palace, again from Bloom. Quote, over the following week, the air attacks continued daily, strafing or bombing ports, fuel tanks, ammunition dumps, military barracks, the international airport, a school, and several cities. 9 persons, including a 3-year-old girl, were reported wounded. An unknown number of houses were set afire by incendiary explosives. During one nighttime raid, a tape recording of a bomb attack was played over loudspeakers set up on the roof of the U.S. Embassy to heighten the anxiety of the capital's residents. When Arbenz went on the air to try to calm the public's fears, the CIA radio team jammed the broadcast. United Fruit Company's publicity office circulated photographs to journalists of mutilated bodies about to be buried in a mass grave as an example of the atrocities committed by the Arbenz regime. Thomas McCann of the company's publicity office later revealed that he had no idea what the photos represented. End quote. Coffee, bananas. In the study of history, you have the realist, revisionist, and post-revisionist camps. And in the case of United Fruit in Guatemala, modern historians still bicker about, United Fruit was just a secondary outcome of the United States battle against communism. And they would be wrong, or at least wrong for the most part. Historian Pierre Oglihesas, relying on Guatemalan archives and sources, reveals deeper than realized communist sympathies and influence in 1950s Guatemala. But this is also inaccurate. Communism is one of those things that, without a name, can look like nearly anything. For example, when exactly did Guatemala cross the threshold to become a capital C communist threat? Was it the adoption of New Deal-inspired human rights or social programs by Arevalo? If so, then perhaps communism had also appealed to Roosevelt, or perhaps it is the fundamental role of a government to ensure some measure of social safety, security, if you will, to its citizens. If it was the expropriation of unused tillable land, which was then leased to Guatemalan farmers, was it the expropriation itself, or was it the transition from private to public property? Was it simply the notion that the land within a country belongs to the people of that country? Arbenz's economic plan involved collecting rent out of the farmer's production. It did not assume complete ownership of the literal fruits of labor. The Guatemalan state did not own the means of production, but rather leased the resources, nor did it own the fruits of labor, but collected payment out of part. There is everything capitalist about this arrangement and little of communism in it, except for the transition from private to public property. The fair distribution of land to those who arguably have an inherent right to use it, charging them fair rent, and making provisions for urban workers to have dignified work because they were not farmers, has no political or ideological name. You can call it whatever you want. Arbenz had done something that was unique to the knowers of things. He held a position of power and, instead of abusing it for his own gain, developed policy in good faith and, more importantly, delivered on them almost without delay. In this sense, if Arbenz called himself a communist in secret, if he aligned himself with other communists in public, if we simply know now what the CIA knew then, we can at least look at the half-century leading up to the Guatemalan coup and wonder with earnestness what any rational person should have to fear. There is no reason, politically, for America to be concerned with the practical implementations of Guatemalan economic policy. Even if Arbenz announced aloud that he was communist, a look at his government's approach to land reform would show that he indeed exercised a capitalist methodology. There is, however, enormous reason for the U.S. to be concerned economically with those policies. It was a losing position for us and our love for bananas and coffee. Socialism, communism, and democracy are thrown around in a knee-jerk way. If it is not X, then it is Y. More often than not, we don't even grasp the words we're applying, or that the words have degrees of variation, from little c to big C communism. But the evidence against the Dulles boys and Eisenhower, as far as knowing that Arbenz posed no real communist threat, and that United Fruit stood the most to gain from Guatemala reverting back to a U.S.-friendly government, is well documented. In context of the entire history of U.S. interventions and coups, and of course Elon Musk's trolling, we have an authentic glimpse into how international economic and political matters intertwine in the minds and actions of those who stand to gain the most. That evidence does away with innocent claims of American democracy abroad. It also does away with inauthentic fears of communism. and it takes the communist influence at face value. What threat did Guatemala pose other than to corporate interest? Evo Morales, whom Musk indeed tried to do a coup on in the 21st century, ran on essentially the same platform as Jacobo Arbenz in the mid-20th century, only Morales' party is explicitly the Socialist Party. While Americans like the asshole former Mayor Boyd are keen to shit on and condemn socialism and communism, we do not interfere in foreign governments in modern times because we are afraid of communism. We find other reasons to do a coup because the communist angle has simply played out. The consistent factor remains the corporate interest. Economic freedom, private enterprise unfettered by public accountability, is the only reason for the state to engineer a coup. So, fuck Elon Musk and fuck the Dulcises. That was Murder for Bananas. Of course, this was not a comprehensive look into the entire history of United Fruit, merely a brief glimpse into the deep-seated rift between the private enterprise and the public interest. You can learn a lot more about bananas and our weird American obsession with them all over the internet. Just Google United Fruit or Guatemala or Jacobo Arbenz or American imperialism. Of course, we've done a lot of the legwork for you in that department. Just head over to askaleftist.com for more resources. Our next chapter is Only Villains, a look at how capital imperialism can only persist if we make enemies of foreign nations. Oh, we also get to learn about international trade.